Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Suerie Moon. I am the co-director of the Global Health Center at the Geneva Graduate Institute. It's my great honor and pleasure to be moderating this session, Progressing Pandemic Preparedness. I do hope that we can indeed progress further on pandemic preparedness. Before introducing our fantastic panel of speakers today, I'll just offer a few housekeeping and framing remarks, and then we'll dive right into the topic of the day. And those of you who are hovering near the door, please feel free to come in and take a seat. So the topic of this panel is, of course, as you can see, pandemic preparedness, but even more so, it's really about looking at new business models. And when I saw these words in the description of the panel, I was very excited because that's exactly the topic of my research that has been very generously supported by the Swiss National Science Foundation. How do we actually achieve both innovation and improved access to medicines, which is very much the theme that we'll be running through our discussions today. I wanted to remind you all that you can already begin to participate in the conversation about this panel at the hashtag GESDA Summit on social media, and you can certainly also continue after. I'm going to go through two relatively quick rounds of questions with our esteemed panelists, and then open the floor to comments and questions from all of you. So I hope that you'll come ready and that we can make the best use of our very short time that we have together today. I'd like to open the discussion by just reminding us all of three key points. And the first is that the threat of pandemics remains very real. It has not receded. I think many people no longer want to think about COVID-19. It was not an easy time for most of us. And in fact, the level of political priority has dropped quite dramatically. So while it absolutely should be a political priority, the question of whether it is and whether it's high enough on the political agenda is something that we can certainly question. And I imagine I'll be hearing about this from some of my colleagues today. When I say pandemics, I'm talking both about fast, visible pandemics like COVID-19, but also slow, silent pandemics like antimicrobial resistance. And you don't have to go very far into your newspapers every day to see reminders, in fact, that the threat remains very real. We have an ongoing emergency of Mpox, for example, across sub-Saharan Africa. We have a very concerning ongoing spread of H5N1 influenza in dairy cattle in the US, bird flu that has not been seen before, with certainly human cases as well. And of course, the ongoing spread of antimicrobial resistance, the recent topic of the high-level meeting in New York at the UN General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago.
And Marburg.
Marburg virus as well, thank you very much. So we could go on in terms of the outbreaks, but what we have to remember is that the driving root causes of outbreaks of emerging and re-emerging infectious disease have not changed, have not gone away since 2019, for example, whether that's intensified trade and travel, land use change, bringing humans and wildlife closer together, climate change, of course, changing our ecosystems, intense agriculture and livestock raising, urbanization, et cetera, et cetera. These are trends that are not changing in the next 5, 10, or 25 years. And on top of that, of course, armed conflict, which is very high on the political agenda, but not always understood that armed conflict is also, for example, a driver of antimicrobial resistance. And new research, new science is actually helping us to understand more and more some of the complex linkages between these drivers and the risk of epidemics or pandemics. So that's really the first key point I wanted to flag. We are certainly not out of the woods in terms of danger. The second key point I wanted to raise is just a brief reminder of what actually happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as many people have said, it was a scientific triumph, the development of a vaccine in less than 1 year, quite a phenomenal achievement, but a moral failure in terms of who actually got access to those vaccines quickly. And by the end of the first year after vaccines became available, only 1% had reached low-income countries. And I think this is a very well-known outcome, that the access to vaccines basically followed an income gradient. So high-income countries vaccinated their people the fastest, then upper middle, then lower middle, and then low-income countries really coming in at the very end. Every country scrambled for access to vaccines, and it wasn't just that we had limited production, but also export bans, hoarding, high prices, etc. Many reasons why countries struggled. I'm glad we have Seth Berkley sitting next to me, who was at the time the CEO of Gavi, which was one of the key partners in the COVAX initiative, which delivered about 2 billion doses, an unprecedented public health feat, delivered those doses to a wide number of low and middle income countries, but long after they had reached, in fact, high income countries. What is perhaps less well understood in the Geneva community is that other countries that had not traditionally provided vaccines also played a more important role. So China is an example of an emerging power that also supplied about 2 billion vaccines to primarily middle-income countries, developing countries. And this point about emerging economies, what role will they play in the next 5, 10, 25 years, I think is an important point to keep in mind. The last framing comment I'd like to make is that there are many structural changes that we all identified were needed in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, but many of them undone. So we have amended the international health regulations, an important political accomplishment, but not enough to actually address some of the challenges I've just flagged. Negotiations towards a pandemic agreement, still ongoing, quite difficult actually. Efforts to diversify production as well as innovation of vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics, high on the political agenda, but still quite early, and no guarantee they will succeed. I think we'll hear more about that from our speakers. And the reason I flag all of these points is because I think it's a reminder of why new business models are very much needed. And if we stick with old business models, we'll probably have the same outcomes that we saw during the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm really delighted to welcome four diverse and very experienced and knowledgeable speakers. And I'm going to just briefly say a few words about who they are and then dive into some questions, taking the challenge from GESDA to think about the future, to anticipate. I've asked my panelists, in fact, to help us think about 2030, 2040, and 2050. So to my immediate left is Dr. Seth Berkley, as I mentioned, former CEO of Gavi. He's also the founder and former head of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, a public health physician with many, many years working on a wide range of both outbreaks as well as chronic crises, and now involved in many different, very interesting technological initiatives. Very much looking forward to hearing your reflections, Seth. Next over, we have Dr. Meret Gaugler. Excuse me, I need to make sure I don't mispronounce or get your affiliation wrong. Meret is an investor. She has worked for both public and private equity investors. She's got broad expertise across the healthcare sector, and she's currently partner at large in growth investments for Nova Holdings, as well as an advisor on life sciences strategy for the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. Very much bringing in both the public and private perspective, which I appreciate. Next, we have Dr. Andrin Oswald, who is the founder and the director of the Swiss Vaccine Initiative, a relatively new initiative. He has long experience working in the pharmaceutical sector, including looking at this from both a philanthropic but also the business side for Novartis for many years. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jen Cohn, an infectious disease physician who's director of access for GARD-P, a public-private product development partnership. GARD-P is the Global Alliance for Research, the Global Antibiotics Research and Development Partnership. Sorry about that. With a long experience also in public health. So fantastic, diverse background. I'm going to begin actually with Seth and then turn to Jen and ask you both to paint for us a worst case scenario for 2050. If we don't make certain changes now, what will the world look like in terms of our ability to deal with outbreaks of infectious disease? Please.
So thank you so much, and my job is not to scare you, but I might. I think we have to start by let's look back at COVID. COVID had a mortality rate of about 1.5%, and it ended up costing the world $12 trillion. And, estimates probably around 25 million deaths. We have a lot of agents out there that have much, much higher mortality rates and that have, a similar type of spread. So clearly, in terms of magnitude of deaths, it could be very, very large. In fact, there will be a new report, the Commission for Investing in Health 3.0, that will be released next week at the World Health Summit. And they've taken some estimates of this, of looking out, you said in, let's say, 2050. So if you look at a 10-year, a 25-year period, obviously you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and it's episodic, but it's something like 25%, 10-year probability of a outbreak that's causing 25 million deaths. And that rises to close to 50% if you take a 25-year probability. Now, why is that important? You started by saying people aren't so interested in COVID anymore, and I think that's exactly right. But what we need to be thinking about is, what's the burden? What would it look like if we just took the average mortality from one of these? And if you use the numbers that we just talked about, it would be about 2.5 million deaths per year, which is larger than AIDS, TB, and malaria. So the reason it's important to think about that is, from a public policy point of view, preparedness is absolutely critical. Now, are we better prepared today? You've already talked about the challenges in setting things up and building new systems. We are somewhat better prepared, but we're not systematically doing the work we need to be in a better place. Part of that is investment. Part of it is changes we need to have in biology, surveillance, diagnostic tests, and then interventions. And let me just make one last point, which is that's the scary side. The good side is, we're right now in a renaissance in vaccine development. The science is amazing. We have all kinds of new tools we can talk about, including AI, which is now being used directly on these issues. And, what we need to do is catch up. And the big challenge with that is it's become politicized. And so at the end of the day, if we can't get beyond that politicization, we are going to have a problem being able to do it, because obviously at the end, it's going to be the science that is going to help us. And if everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts.
Thanks very much, Seth, for the very sobering but precise predictions. Jen, so Seth mentioned about 2.5 million deaths per year. What does a situation for AMR look like by 2050?
Yeah, this is a great question. So already AMR is leading to more deaths than HIV and malaria combined. And it's estimated by 2050, that's going to only grow by 70%. Now, the issue with this is that antibiotics really underpin much of modern medicine. We can't have surgeries, we can't treat cancer. Even safe childbirth is really dependent on our access to antibiotics, and increasingly novel antibiotics as the bacteria evolve and develop resistance. And in many ways, this world is already here. So I work clinically at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. We have access to all the antibiotics as they come out. And I've also worked clinically in Nairobi, Kenya. So I had a patient just a couple weeks ago. We had to use an antibiotic that just was approved by the US FDA just a few months before. Now, we were able to cure that infection. In Kenya, I've also had patients with much simpler infections that probably could have been treated by antibiotics in where I work in Philadelphia, but those antibiotics are not available. So in some ways, this situation is already here in many low and middle income countries where we can't treat very basic infections. But what I think will come even kind of accelerate over the next 25 years or so is that we're already seeing an exit of major pharmaceutical companies from research and development. We're seeing increasing shortages of manufacturing capacity and therefore shortages of antibiotics. And even when antibiotics are developed, oftentimes they're developed now by small and medium-sized enterprises. And so those antibiotics basically come to market and then fail because they simply don't get the returns that they need when they're launching just in the US. So we need to fundamentally change how we think about how to both develop but then make antibiotics really sustainable. And I'm hoping we can talk a little bit more about that and avoid the situation where basically we've lost modern medicine.
Thanks very much, Jen. It's exactly actually the question I wanted to pose to Andrin, who has founded a relatively new initiative, the Swiss Vaccines Initiative. You've heard now that we're not necessarily heading in a great direction by 2050 when we think about outbreaks of infectious disease, including those related to AMR. What needs to change? What kinds of business models could make a difference, both in capturing the potential of science that Seth has reminded us about, but also addressing what is really a perennial challenge that Jen reminded us about, which is access? And what's your strategy for doing that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. 10 years ago, I was running as CEO of the vaccines business of Novartis, and we had the swine flu that may some of you recall. And I was based in the US, and I was in a position to having to choose more or less which government gets when vaccine, and to kind of resist the tremendous pressure that you receive in such a position from governments who say, well, if you don't put us first, then you can imagine what's happening. So I think that experience in my mind made me think, how can it be, that governments don't do more so that we're better prepared, because it's simply impossible for a company to take care of that. When the pandemic started, I got a call from the Swiss government and said, hey, here in Bern, we have nobody really who understands vaccines. Would you come and take on the position of being the delegate of vaccines procurement for the Swiss government? So not out of free will, I found myself 10 years later in a position on the other side of the table negotiating for the government access to a vaccine. And I must say that experience was even more uncomfortable and terrifying, because given I was living in Switzerland, I realized, well, if you don't get access, it has a direct impact on your children, your friends, and everybody asked me, what are you going to do? When do we get it? We started early on to negotiate with US companies, but it was pretty clear that the US would come first. That's even what the US law says, so it was a very difficult position to be in. So out of that started this initiative that I was part of, together with some of the colleagues, including Patrick Ebischer, that may some of you know. We also had some ex-government colleagues and some private high net worth individuals who said, what can we do to somewhat solve that? How is it possible that you can have a pandemic problem, a threat that everybody knows is real, that if it happens, even in a small country like Switzerland, creates tens of billions of dollars of damage, purely economical, not even talking about the lives lost. It's a huge market. So why is there not more business investments in trying to address it? And I think one of the few positive things that came out of this pandemic was actually the dramatic advancement that science has made with nucleic acid technology for vaccines. And that would never, ever have happened if we had this pandemic. Now, what we're doing is we're leveraging that unique, in my mind, scientific opportunity to create a new business model that makes it sustainable for investment. We do need some policy changes for that, not much, but we do need some. We're starting in Switzerland, because I think Switzerland is a good small country to start with a promise to create in Switzerland a center of excellence, entrepreneurial, driven as an enterprise that will provide Switzerland exclusive access for sovereign decisions on pandemic protection in the future. That model, based on a nucleic acid solution that we can install in Switzerland, in parallel, we would like to export to other countries who have a similar interest. And the beauty of what we're trying to do is, given that the technology is now so far that it is investable and you can manage it in a much smaller setting than old, larger vaccines facilities, is you can place it even in smaller countries, and you can connect it to universities in those countries. So we're trying to build that model such that each country who gets such a unit and a facility agrees also to share the science and insights that are created in a pandemic. That means that if a pandemic hits, if the University of Geneva, with the facility that we have here, finds the right vaccines candidate, that exact code and science that you would find, no need for debates, negotiations about patents, tech transfer, it can be immediately transferred to a facility of similar size in Qatar, in Singapore, in Argentina, wherever it stands. How do we make it economically viable? I think we want to sign long-term pandemic contracts with governments who are interested in that. And the other element of it, of course, that is critical is it is all about scientific advancements and making sure that the investments needed to provide such a solution become smaller and smaller. Even now, I think that building such a facility costs probably only a tenth of what it cost 5 years ago.
A tenth. This is amazing, and I think this is really the promise of technology in a way, but I heard you mention two other things that I think are very relevant for our next speaker, Meret Gaugler, which is the importance of sustainable investment and also governments as your clients. So I'm wondering, Meret, sometimes we hear that investors can enable new business models. Sometimes we hear that investors get in the way of new business models. What do you see as the potential role of investors, and are investors willing to accept sometimes lower returns in order to actually meet global public health objectives?
Yes, thank you for the question. I choose to look at that from an optimistic point of view first. I don't think the two should be or are in fact incompatible, at least not always. I choose to hope that they're actually more compatible now after COVID than they've been before. And I'd really like to take this a step back and maybe speak from the angle of preparedness as prevention, and also just the things we can do beyond the limelight of, shiny, new, fancy technologies. Of course, they play their part, but it's not the only thing that's going on here. I think COVID was a triple wake-up call, and it also changed the perspective of private capital on how to invest or how to reap benefits from these initiatives. COVID showed us how expensive it can get if we have the money to spend on it and, take the full brunt of crisis management. COVID also laid bare what the vulnerabilities were, both the vulnerabilities in the system and then the vulnerabilities on the population front. And these vulnerabilities cost someone a lot of money, and they do so near term, right? Not just in case of an acute crisis. And I think people are more prepared today and focus a lot more on prevention at the population health level, on addressing some of these fallacies on the operational level within the healthcare systems, because they realize that the payback time on these actually doesn't need to be so lengthy. That's the optimistic take. Then I won't hide from you that we come up on many pitches and potential investments in our day-to-day lives, which prove utterly frustrating because the technology is there to do better, and yet the incentives in the system are completely misaligned, right? And that's really where it gets tricky, and antimicrobial resistance is a very good example of that. If we could just get a nudge from the regulator to set the bar for everyone to, make economically viable models for better means of detection, there isn't even that much need for fancy new technology beyond just, having a different path to changing clinical practice. And I think that brings me back to the prevention angle on the population level as well, right? We're looking much more today at who was most vulnerable in the last pandemic. And it goes from access to fresh, healthy food to immune diseases to overweight. And again, I think as much as the payback has shortened, at least in the minds of private capital investors, it's also the job, unfortunately, of the regulator to make sure that these changes are implemented in a great number of people at the same time. Because otherwise you run the risk immediately, or you run into the wall of whoever pays for the preventive measure is very unlikely to be the beneficiary of the cost you saved.
And I think one of the things that you said that I hear is kind of a recurrent theme already is often a frustration that technology is there. The potential of technology is breathtaking. Technology has advanced so fast. But the politics or the laws or the regulation or the money, all of these other pieces of the puzzle don't seem to be falling into place. So I'm hoping, I'm going to ask another quick round of questions and then we'll turn to all of you. But let me turn, Jen, back to you and ask you to paint us actually a more hopeful or positive scenario, again, looking forward to 2040 to 2050. Could we do better than the scenario that you outlined, and what's a role that GARDP could play?
Okay, yeah. So I absolutely think we can do better. So there was also a recent paper out that said if we actually improve access to antibiotics, we can save 50 million lives in the next 25 years. That's pretty good. I would love to do that. But I think that the current system and incentives are misaligned. So we are seeing a failure of R&D, we're seeing a failure of manufacturing, and then we are seeing failures and fallout of the market even once antibiotics actually get registered. Unfortunately, the current conversation, at least in antibiotics, has focused really on push funding, so grants and things, and then pull incentives, so milestone prizes or other things. But honestly, I think we need a fundamentally different approach, because this is a place where we actually have, it's not a small market. It's only a small market if only you look at the US. There is a large market where the burden is highest, and that's in low and middle income countries. So we need to think about how we can get a win-win here, which is by providing access to where there is a large market, making that access sustainable and affordable, but making sure that we're also thinking about sustainability, especially for these small and medium-sized enterprises that are probably going to carry forward antibiotic research and development. And so rather than just push and pull, which I don't believe is sustainable or sufficient, I think what we actually need to do is think about an entire new access and R&D ecosystem for AMR. And this would include, I think, 4 main things. First is a nonprofit drug development model that can help support and work in public-private partnerships to support small and medium-sized enterprises, including through support for CMC or manufacturing efficiencies and capabilities that many small and medium-sized enterprises don't have. Next is early licensing to make sure that we have manufacturing capacity and decrease that risk for manufacturing bottlenecks and shortages, but also so that we can reach kind of joint launch in the United States and in low and middle income countries so that we achieve that win-win of access and also sufficient revenue to sustain these companies. Finally, I would say we need also market efficiencies. So we need to make sure we are harmonizing and consolidating some of our priorities. We need to pool some of the procurement, some of the things we've learned actually in HIV, TB, and vaccines that have worked really well. We can take those lessons and apply them to AMR to make this market more efficient and sustainable. And then finally, I think this needs to be a priority in terms of the implementation and uptake at the national and regional level.
Thanks very much. Seth, so Jen is calling for a different R&D ecosystem and has really emphasized the role of SMEs, and I understand you're working with a number of SMEs now. I'd love to hear, do you think a different R&D ecosystem is possible? If so, what does it look like? And of course, I can't resist now that you have your Gavi hat off. I'd love to ask your views on what role do you see a large player like Gavi playing in 2050? The world will look very different. Hopefully it'll look better than it does today. But how do we think about changes in the global health architecture, as we call it, in the light of all of these changing technologies, these changing trends, emerging economies, et cetera?
I mean, there's 2 big problems. And one is making sure that people want to do the right thing here. And you've talked about that, and I think it really is critical. If I look at what happened during COVID, there was 11 billion doses of vaccine made in 2021. And you're absolutely right, 1% went to LICs, but the inefficiencies were the behaviors of governments. But at the same time, if I look at the US, 1/3 of people weren't vaccinated and 2/3 weren't boosted. And most of that was related to misinformation. So I think we need the science, but we also need to change mindsets and get political support for science that's going to be critical. Now, if I look at something like a Gavi in the future, we're going to have more and more technologies. I believe we are entering this renaissance in vaccines against a range of diseases, TB, hopefully someday HIV, Group B strep. We have malaria vaccines. We're really moving forward. The question is going to be, what's the access model? And the answer is there already are models, and you already referred to that, of different ways we can come together, public and private, to make this affordable and be able to move it forward. forward. And I think we tested these in Gavi before, but now we've also tested them in the COVAX situation, where we have funds that are available immediately, zero-day funds, to be able to fund R&D and to fund access at the beginning. But we also have to have then the ability to make sure that money can follow that. And the last thing I'd say, which is really important, is more universal. This gets to what Andrin talked about, more universal access to manufacturing. That's already happening. We went from 5 manufacturers to 24 manufacturers, majority in high-income countries in 2000 to now the majority in developing countries. The largest manufacturing facility in the world is not in the US and Europe, it's in India. And so, I mean, the point can be is we can do a much better job getting facilities out, but facilities alone won't solve the problem. You have to have the science that goes with it, the sharing of that, so that we can produce, as Andrin said, if you want to make a new vaccine, that everybody who has the facilities gets the technology that is going to be critical at that moment. And that's part of what the 100-day program that CEPI's trying to do is.
I'm glad you flagged access to technology, because I think that's one of the more difficult issues, actually. We can have amazing islands of science everywhere. We can have fantastic production facilities everywhere. But let's say there's one company or lab that develops the new vaccine we need for Mpox or H5N1 or Marburg or disease X, but they don't want to transfer the technology, which is a big problem we saw during COVID-19.
But even if they want to transfer the technology, there's only a small group of people who have the skill sets. And so the challenge is going to be expanding that set of people who can do those tech transfers, both from the giver and the receiving side.
And this is a question I actually want to raise with Andrin, because I think your model, is, if I've understood it well, is indeed to facilitate and to set up this very decentralized network of production facilities, and that the technology enables that is really something quite phenomenal. But how can we address this challenge of technology transfer, which today is still one of the most difficult issues in the pandemic treaty negotiations? Countries have been fighting about this for years, since the 1970s at least. What do you have in mind? How do we actually make it easier for not just products, but actually knowledge and technologies to flow across borders?
So I think the general question of how to do tech and knowledge transfer during what we call peacetime, meaning non-pandemic, I think is a big topic a lot of people work on. So I don't want to comment on that. I believe eventually any technology becomes a commodity. Of course, it's nice to accelerate that, but that's happening. But if you talk about pandemic preparedness, it takes a whole other different dimension, because in a pandemic, there is no time. And we can say, it's good that we developed vaccine in a year, at least for some parts of the population, but a year is simply too long. I mean, if you have, let's say, a 5% mortality rate, not in people who are 75 or older, but in people who are 5 years and younger. I mean, imagine what this will do to the world, and to say, just wait a year, something is coming, is simply not good enough. So a tech transfer always takes time, and there is no time for that. So that's why I think the thinking must be, what type of science will make a tech transfer obsolete? So that we can build something by which, in the technology, the tech transfer already is intrinsically happening. I mean, the longer-term vision, talking about 2050, would be that you don't have such a nucleic acid facility just one per country, but maybe you have one per city. I mean, you can envision one day you would have one at home if you wish. That's, of course, for the long term. But when we think about thinking big and what is possible with the digital solutions we have, the biological solutions we have, I have little doubt that eventually we'll get there. And I hope Swiss Vaccines as an initiative can at least make one step into that direction.
Thanks very much. Meret, I want to turn to you, and then we'll open up to the audience here, as I mentioned. One of the reasons why we sometimes hear companies saying, I can't transfer this technology, is because my investors expect me to maximize returns. And if I transfer all the technology, I've just enabled a bunch of my competitors. And this is really where I want to tap into your knowledge, looking both at the perspective of private as well as public investors. What is the role that private investors can or should play? Generally speaking, the stereotype is that private investors are much more tolerant of risk, but they want a big return. Private investors, longer term, may be more patient, but not quite uncomfortable with high risk, but they'll take a slower or lower return. So you've seen both sides, you continue to see both sides. What do you see as the right role for each of these types of investors to play if we're really going to progress on pandemic preparedness?
I'd rather make the distinction actually between public money and private money, private investor money in private companies or in public companies, right? Because I don't think there the gap is actually that large. I would say, I talked a little bit about COVID having woken us up and hopefully in reality and in everyone's mind shortened that time frame that we think of in terms of payback. That's absolutely first and foremost, right? I think the regulator there can help by setting stronger incentives, giving everyone a little bit more of a framework for what those timelines look like. Other than that, it's not a magic formula, right? It's simply a sliding scale of what is the acceptable level of risk for people to efficiently deploy their capital, right? So I choose to hope that doing right and making money in the process, if capital is efficiently allocated, is measurable. I think COVID is not a good blueprint for us to think of how these step changes in innovation happen and how you make money on them or don't. I think COVID was a very special time and place in that, the solve wasn't just for a health crisis, the solve was for a political and financial crisis at the same time, and maybe even more so. I think going forward, us talking about antimicrobial resistance as a sort of slow-moving, iterative, just level of incentives that you need to keep up longer term makes more sense. And again, sliding scale, right? It possibly, if that horizon is shortened nowadays, it can reach from people putting straight money on the table and receiving a payback within a 5-year horizon to much longer term investors who have a bit more patience, to longer term investors who have a second arm, which may be a philanthropic arm, which will help bridge some of these less visible technologies over to where capital can actually be put at risk to, last ditch, sometimes public money having to cop in and reserve capacity, for example, where no one else would be willing to put that capital up.
Okay, thanks very much. I hear you describing distinct but important roles that both kinds of investors need to play really to push forward the science and technology, but also to do it in such a way that we can incorporate global access objectives into the technological development process. So as I promised, we'll now open the floor to all of you. Please just raise your hand and I'll call on you. I'll ask you to introduce yourself briefly and then pose your comment or question. I see 4 different hands up, all men. So I will call on 1 or 2 of you, but hope some women will raise their hands too. Okay, please. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Max Schaffer from the Simon Institute for Long-Term Governance. I think I have an ethical dilemma to raise to you. When we need prevention, we need preparedness, but the reality of politics is that policymakers have limited attention. And the question to you is, when should we aim for prevention? When should we aim for reaction? Arguably, we reacted to COVID-19. It's suboptimal, but arguably it worked. And when is prevention absolutely necessary? And when is reaction inevitable and in the end possible?
Great. Thanks very much. I'm going to take a collection and we'll take, yes, oh, you already have the mic. Okay, please.
Thank you so much. Jonas Pasquier from the Swiss mission in Geneva. Thank you to the panelists for their insights. One question also related to the broader political context. One thing that clearly emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic is that it all but increased the trust deficits among nations, between societies, with regards to public health. And the situation should be far worse the next time around, even if the next pandemic is tomorrow or in a few years, not speaking about the next 15, 20, 25 years also, because we hear from other panels during the GESDA summit that the information environment will be much more challenging going forward. So what should be done in this respect to sort of restore trust and be having a more cohesive response, socially speaking, politically speaking. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonas. So I don't have full control over the mics, that's fine, but if we have any women who would like the floor? No? Not yet? Please. And then up front, here we go. Very good. We'll take the gentleman here, please.
Okay. Oh,
you have the floor, and then we'll turn to you.
Gregory Tutton in the Diplomatic Corps for the Order of Malta at the UN. A general question, you mentioned the pandemic treaty, and Andrin, I think you've mentioned a business model that would be more bilateral, company to government, but it's also sounding a bit as what was just mentioned by the Swiss mission. To what extent does multilateralism, whether it's government to government or region to region, have a role in the light of the consistent challenges faced by Tedros at WHO? And then to what extent is a bilateral model a better model? I know that one of the ways the White House was preparing in the potential for the collapse of the pandemic treaty was to start having government-to-government bilateral relations out of Washington. Is that also then a way that Switzerland could solve that, but from a corporate to country standpoint for the tech transfer you're referring to? But long-term, how does all of it get solved in a multilateral way? Because disease isn't restricted to regions. Disease is global. How do we get multilateralism to actually function?
Thank you. Huge question here in Geneva. Please, up in the front row. What I'll do is I'll pause, because I'm not sure how many questions we can hold in our heads, get a quick set of responses, and then come back. And I've seen some hands that I'll try to remember to call on in the next round, please.
Hello, I'm May. I'm with the Villars Institute as well as the
That's me, sorry. I think it's off.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Sorry. I'm May. I'm with the Villars Institute. Something Mr. Berkley said really stood out to me of how it's necessary in order to push these, preparing for the potential next pandemic, that we need to change the mindsets of the people around us, of policymakers. But given that you all come from very different backgrounds in the health industry, how do you recommend we, as in everyone in this room, and we, as in the younger generation, push for this change in mindset? Because it can be very difficult when you've grown up with this set of views and values and have held them, are very set in your ways. And how do we just push our leaders around us to change the way they see the world, so we can change the world?
Great question. I'm going to start with Seth. You had at least one question addressed directly to you, and then I'll just go down the line.
So a great set of questions, and they're actually kind of linked. On the issue, I mean, the world needs to get serious about prevention. I think this is where we start. And I don't like using military analogies because, we understand that military is very different than what we want in peace, but you would never have a military that doesn't think long-term, that doesn't have long-term investments, that isn't preparing, that isn't doing war games to game it out. And we really don't have that the way we should in prevention. So what we need, and the points that a number of people made in the questions, this is a global problem. I mean, yes, you can do bilateral things, but you never know where the next outbreak's going to be. You never know where the next technology is going to come from. And certainly in AMR, it moves around just, 1 billion people are flying around the world. It moves around with people, et cetera, and with animals and all of that. So what we need to do is build a strong prevention system. You will still have to be reactive, but you have to have that type of investment. And that requires a mindset change. It requires everybody to see it's a problem. We said a lot, nobody's safe unless everybody is safe during the last pandemic. People didn't believe it. And I think the thing that I would hope that the young populations will do is to take on this issue of science and truth. Now, I understand in a pandemic situation, you're moving and making decisions quickly, science changes, you don't know what's happening, but you have to explain that. But at the end, you can only fall back to truth. And we've lost trust of institutions, we've lost trust of political leaders, and certainly social media and other things are amplifying that, but we need to get back to a place. And I don't have an answer of how to do it, but this is one of the biggest problems in our societies today, is to get back there, because the science is there, the technology is there, we can make it happen, even the resources are there. It just needs this mindset change.
Thanks very much. Meret?
I don't know that I held many of them in my head, so I'm just going to riff and see where it takes me. I think on the question of reaction versus prevention, I wouldn't personally lose sight of the fact that budget and budget constraint plays a big role there, right? Some of the public money is relatively fickle. It shifts priorities one day to another, and I don't think, the last crisis was what it was. The pandemic was managed the way it was because we had full war chests. We don't afterwards, but that's actually leading me right into an optimistic angle as well. I think I choose to believe that necessity will breed innovation. The question is where the pain point lies, and it can be way beyond where you would like it to lie. But we spent so much money on the last pandemic that we've all woken up to the fact that there isn't so much more to go around, right? So innovation in healthcare, that's the one sector where investing is so exciting because of that. Ultimately, innovation should mean you taking out cost. This was an empty promise or an empty narrative for a really long time. I think it's becoming reality. And again, I choose to believe that that's actually going to be a very big driver of innovation. Again, if you play it on the preparedness, i.e. prevention side, you need to go back to much more fundamental issues, right? We saw that who was most at risk in the US was socioeconomically defined. This is extremely complex to resolve as a problem, but we need to make sure people are also taking more responsibility, they can take more responsibility, and they realize that it has a cost for them, for everyone, if you live unhealthy lives. And I think, unfortunately, that brings us to much, much bigger solves here. But the beauty of having spent so much money is that there isn't so much left, and it means that pain comes faster, and we really have to do something about it.
Right, thanks very much. We have time also for Andrin and Jen to respond. I just wanted to flag the issue of multilateralism versus a more bilateral or unilateral approaches, as well as the challenges indeed of thinking about the future. And if you could try to address those comments. So Andrin, please.
Yeah. So I think it's not either or, but that was not what you suggested. But what to do when. I mean, the vision of a world that has a system by which, in a pandemic, the first vaccines goes to the person who needs it most, philosophically, and have a framework and 170 plus countries agreeing to that. I mean, that is a beautiful aspiration, and I hope that the WHO and others make progress in that. In the absence of that, established, I think there's a lot of opportunity for people, and especially also young people, as it was said earlier during the conference, to leverage science that can drive intrinsically for that access, and to try to find the right bilateral partnerships who make that happen. So in that sense, I look at our Swiss Vaccines Initiative. The nucleic acid technology has such a beautiful intrinsic opportunity to be democratized, and to, rather than building some central kind of government or anyone who has the power on how to address it, to actually provide this in a right way to different stakeholders who are interested in that idea. So when I look at, let's say, our initiative, how to approach it, we try to find governments who are bilaterally interested in doing this. It's quite opportunistic in that sense. Where is the interest? And find the ones who love this idea to say, if it works with you, would you agree that the science that you develop, you make it on your system accessible to the other countries who do it too? There's no cost to doing that. And if you have a few governments who agree to that, and it starts to become a model that people hear of, then maybe eventually it's becoming multinational, multilateral. But I think from a business or entrepreneur point of view, we start with where we think we find that stakeholder is interested in it, and then you slowly start to build it up.
Thanks very much. Jen, last word to you.
Great. So I'll just kind of comment on the change in mindset, and two things on that, and the second one relates to the multilateralism a bit. One, I think in some ways we need to forget the current systems and say, what if I could build a system for access and for pandemic preparedness without all of what we do now and kind of the incentives that exist? What would that look like? And start from there. And the other thing I would say is that I think one of the biggest dangers to pandemic preparedness and AMR included in that is actually this growing nationalism. I think that with growing nationalism, we are going to become closed, and as I described earlier, especially for antibiotics and kind of AMR, we are going to succeed together or we're going to fail together. And if we can't realize that we need that microbes cross borders and that we actually need the entire world in order to both develop and sustain access to antibiotics, we're going to end up in that disaster scenario that we described at the beginning.
Thanks. I think that sober reminder is actually a great note on which to end, and I apologize because I promised you a second round of questions, but there are these angry red numbers blinking at me, telling me we've gone over time. So what I'm going to do is try to summarize very quickly with the recognition I'm standing between you and a reception. So the first point I'd like to flag as a takeaway is that the problems and the predictions for 2050 are dire. They're very real. We have a 1 in 2 chance of a pandemic that will kill 25 million people between now and 2050. But the optimism on scientific technology, I think, that we heard today is actually very high in terms of where we already are, where we could be going. But the problem, it seems, and this is really my second takeaway, is not so much the science and technology, it's actually the ecosystem. So when we think about new business models, we shouldn't only be thinking about that amazing initiative, that one organization that's doing incredible things, but actually we need to be thinking about new business models in terms of R&D ecosystems, technological ecosystems that also address financing, that also address regulation, that address misinformation and trust, that also address politics, the need for diplomacy, and that can potentially live up to some of these more optimistic visions, I think, that we heard in the second part of the panel. The last point I would make, and I think we heard it very clearly from all of you, is that the stakes are very high. And every single person here, I'm sure, was personally and directly and negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we don't want to go through that again. So the stakes could not be higher. But the D in GESDA, I think, is really an important angle of the conference, and I think this panel, which is the importance, indeed, of thinking about the social science aspects, or the societal aspects, together with the science and technology. So with that, I'd like to invite you to continue the conversation. For those who are not able to pose your questions, you can do so at #GESDA Summit. And it's my pleasure to invite you all to join the reception, the first day reception at the Globe, which is just that way, a big globe. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and thanks to all of our participants.